Hi, it's me Jacqueline. Welcome to my channel. If you're new to the channel, then please subscribe my channel and visit my Patreon page, link in the description.
George came home with me at Christmas. A message from his father had arrived to say that as he would be out of the country for the season and his ex-wife was also otherwise engaged, George would be free to accept any invitation he got. I quickly arranged with Aunt Selena that he would share our festivities, and George was eager to come as soon as I got my aunt's permission to bring him. She, knowing a great deal more about him than I did at this time, also put in hand certain magic which would gradually change the memories and the realities of those who had known a boy called George, just as she had already begun for a boy called Philip. She wrote to say that she and the others planned a costumed Christmas in the Victorian period, and that she would expect both of us to dress in the costumes of our choice from the start. The letter also intimated that George would have the room next to mine, but that he might wish to know that some of his other relatives would wish to see him during his stay. She met us at the airport, and we were soon on our way through the apparently ever more deserted and remote landscape surrounding Change. As we drew nearer, I felt a great glow of happiness building inside me, and, looking at George, could see that he was getting more and more excited as we approached. Aunt had been true to her word. Laid out in our rooms were a selection of costumes to choose between for our stay. For both of us there was a choice of either male or female. I did not hesitate and chose the female costume almost without thought. It just seemed natural. George was less certain, but suddenly and decisively chose the female costume as well. When I later asked why, he shrugged and replied, "Because I suddenly knew that I have to accept becoming a female. So I might as well see what it will be like." We laughed and set about helping each other, very inexpertly, to get into them. This was not easy, as neither of us had any experience of the sort of undergarments Victorian women wore. Some were obvious, but some, like the stiff corsets, were not. An added complication was what Aunt referred to as a feminizing belt, in reality a sort of chastity device which held our male genitalia close between our legs, so we needed to squat to use the toilet and ensured that, seen in our bloomers and corsets, we appeared female. Eventually, Aunt and Karen rescued us, and having shown us how to insert ourselves in the belts, laced us into the corsets tightly. It was now very apparent that my figure was well on the way to being feminized. The corset forced my incipient breasts upward and gave them substance and form, albeit small. George was soon almost as feminine in form once his corset was secured, but lacked a bust. With our petticoats and then our dresses and smocks on, only our boyish hair gave us the lie, and this was soon remedied by simply putting us into wigs. "Well, Philippa, well, Georgina," laughed Aunt Selena, "you both make stunning girls. Are you sure this is how you want to stay for the next 3 weeks?" "No, ma'am," whispered George. "I want to stay this way forever," and I nodded my agreement. "You may well get more than you wish for here, my dear," smiled Karen, "because I think you are already changing to your true self." "Yes," said Aunt, seriously, Georgina, I think we need to have a serious talk. Now girls, to work, there is much to be done and little time to do it." She paused and added, "It seems to me that we will have to show you how to be girls while we're at it. Looking at you, Philippa, the sooner the better." From this moment on we were taught how to behave as girls. It may seem strange to hold a Christmas festival in a place like Change where the inhabitants cross the range from what might be considered definitely pagan, and therefore against all the festival stands for in most people's minds, to the downright arcane and perhaps into the realms of what some would almost certainly see as the satanic. Aunt Selena disagreed, stating emphatically that in all societies and in all the dimensions certain great events needed to be marked and celebrated. Christmas was one, Easter another, and she always included as many of the otherworlders as she could. This made for a fascinating festival with some very strange dinner guests. Still, looking back, any outsider would no doubt have assumed that some very good costuming had gone into the preparations. 2 days before the feast it snowed, and not just a light dusting either, a full-blooded blizzard which froze the lakes and fountains and blanked our little world in a thick white blanket of snow. This did not deter our guests in the least, one advantage perhaps of living on a dimensional junction. Most simply traveled through their own much less snowbound landscapes to the house and joined us in celebrating our festival. It was Shirella who put this into perspective for both George and me, saying, "All of us worship a higher being. You call him God. We call him Idilon, which means something of the same. Even the nymphs and sprites have names for the originator of all time, space, and life. It is good to celebrate him so." Since neither of us had considered this before, it gave us something to wonder at as we went about the house decorating, helping with the cleaning and preparing places for those of the visitors who need to have beds or rooms to rest. The sprites simply took over anything they had an affinity for, such as wooden furniture or water in jugs, vases, or bowls. It became quite difficult finding something to drink at one time, since everything seemed to have an occupant. The nymphs found the portraits or the statuary convenient, which left only the centaurs, feminized, satyrs, fauns, and were folk to find rooms or stables for. In the end, we had centaurs in the basement, satyrs and fauns in the east wing, and the feminized in the attic with the werfolk in the west wing. It became quite educational trying to watch all the interactions between all the folk. In deference to the tree folk, no tree was cut for the decoration. Instead, we created a symbolic tree using wood, wire, and loads of decorations. It was great fun and served us well. Gifts, too, proved unusual. Everyone got a token, although with the more elemental people this tended to take the form of favors and magic. During this time, George finally discovered who his people were. Jacqueline recognized him and claimed him for her people, the feminized. Through the 12 days of our festival, he spent more and more time with her and the court she had brought to the feast. Shirella grinned and growled that she had known him for a member of the cat tribe when she had first scented him. Now she knew she would have fun when he had become his own. She could soon put him up a tree. Everyone laughed at this, from a werewolf, attempt at light-hearted banter. It seemed strange when it all came inevitably to an end as our guests drifted back to their own domain, and we were left to the house and our own devices. The odd nymph or sprite turned up unexpectedly, having been left behind while resting in our furnishings or decorations, but it was suddenly very quiet. George and I had a lot of time to explore the experience and to look forward to perhaps repeating it and to discuss our own fates and futures. George was much more settled and happy than I had ever seen him before, and there was already a difference in his movements that was much more cat-like. As we prepared for our return to school for the remainder of the school year, both of us realized that this would be our last return to the life we had so far known. The future lay ahead and was destined to be very different for us both. In the year since I had come to change for the first time, my body had begun to change subtly. At first I did not notice anything different, but by the summer vacation some things had become noticeable. For one thing, my friends and fellows had all developed masculine chests, their genitalia had grown in size, and some had deepening voices. All of us had grown taller, but where my companions had filled out in the upper body and had grown taller, my body had subtly changed and my legs had grown longer. My hips had grown fuller and my pelvis had grown wider while my waist had moved higher and grown narrower. My buttocks had taken on a more rounded and feminine appearance, and it was certain that I could not continue to pass unnoticed for much longer. Most startling, though, was the fact that my genitals had not grown at all. If anything, they had shrunk. I arrived at the airport to be met by my Aunt Selena. "Well, Phil, are you looking forward to coming home?" she asked. "You bet." I laughed. "Aunt, these last couple of months have been very tricky. People have started to notice that I'm not quite the same as the rest of them." I told her as we moved off in the car. She asked how I felt about it and added that she had arranged for me to have alternative schooling for a while. "It's very strange," I told her. "I mean, I'm still technically a boy, but I keep thinking of having sex with my friends." She laughed at that, remarking, "Yes, that was the worst part of it as I remember. And then I was afraid I might be found out. Still, it won't be much longer now. Things will start to speed up once your testicles are retracted and change. I could see how much you had already redeveloped as you came through the terminal. You have the makings of a stunning figure, you know." She grinned. "I think we'll have to get you a chastity belt to protect your virtue once you swap over completely." Once back at Change, I soon slipped back into my routine of writing, swimming, reading, and exploring. Aunt explained that I would not be returning to school. She had advised the school that I was to accompany her to Australia and would be going to school there, but would instead be continuing my studies at Change. This, she explained, would allow me to make the transition from male to female without being exposed to scrutiny or the risk that I might be subjected to teasing or bullying. I told her that I had some doubts about what was happening and explained that I was worried about losing my sexual pleasures. She laughed at this and said I would soon discover I had probably got the better deal by making the change. Almost from the very start this time, I abandoned all male clothing and wore panties, ski pants, skirts, tights, and a range of feminine tops. Even when swimming, I often wore only bikini bottoms or a girl's one-piece swimsuit. My visits to Jacqueline resumed as if they had never stopped, but now the teaching focused more and more on the magic I would need to guard the house and its environs. As my body responded to the change spells turning my maleness to that of a female, I gradually developed more feminine pursuits. One thing that did not change in me, though, was a reluctance to wear a top and to consider male relationships. George joined us at Change in the third week of our holiday break. His previous visit had triggered the magic that would see him change to his grandsire's people, and, like me, he would change to the opposite sex. This seemed to be an inevitable part of the process, but as we were to discover, there was an added dimension in what would happen to George. His human genes would have a part in how he changed, but at the same time his grandsire's otherworld genes seemed to accelerate the changes. Transition. My 14th birthday was a fun affair. We held a party on the pool terrace, and I received the greetings and gifts of all the denizens of the house and grounds in the bright sunlight of a glorious day. George, now almost Georgina, Gialadia, the water sprite Seraphina, the satyr Nymph, a tree sprite named Silvestrina, a centaur Feline, and several fawns all came to greet me and present gifts of their people. Shirella and her maid of fearsome but magnificent male named Garth brought greetings from their people, and I was glad to see them all. Nymph remarked that I was looking more like a mistress now, and Seraphina reprimanded him, saying that soon now I would discover my womanhood. Soon, for an immortal, is a relative term. A week or so later, I was exploring a part of the terrace below the house and found the entrance to a passage. George had gone to talk to Gialadia, and I was alone for the time. The doorway led into an amazing underground maze or labyrinth, and full of the brashness of youth, I fetched a lamp and began to explore. The walls were decorated with amazing murals throughout, and the ceilings decorated as well. It was, in short, an amazing and magical place. Unicorns, sprites, centaurs, and fawns sported and played on the walls. At intervals, statues stood in niches and small fountains, and streams flowed and gurgled along the way. There were 7 distinct stations, at which there were allegorical or symbolic representations where worked on the walls and floor, and at each a sort of bench seat was provided. Eventually, I found myself at the center of the labyrinth in an octagonal chamber with a high domed ceiling and a low table at its center. A feeling of tremendous peace and happiness filled me as I gazed in awe at the wonderfully lifelike frescoes and the amazingly detailed statue of a young woman. I sat and studied the paintings and suddenly became aware of light filling the chamber, then of the fact that the statue had come alive and was looking at me, smiling gently. "Welcome to my chamber," she said in a voice that had echoes like birdsong and wind in trees. "I have been expecting you." "I'm sorry," I replied, rather startled. "I was not told of this place. I only discovered it today." "Who are you and what is this place?" I blurted, then, suddenly realizing how rude this sounded, I added, "I'm sorry, I did not mean to be rude. It's just..." The woman held up a hand to silence me. "I am Aphrodite, the queen of the nymphs. This is our council chamber when we meet in this world. You are the mistress to be of change. How do you find your present and future?" Her smile was warm but somehow regal as she approached me. "I see that you are not yet a woman. No matter, this will pass and you will have beauty and grace." "Thank you," I blushed, "but I am still having a problem deciding whether or not I like changing my sex like this." "Fear not, it will pass and you shall know the joy of your womanhood in time, and much else besides." She looked at me and I realized that her eyes were of a solid color and did not seem to have pupils to them. "I see also that you will have many different tastes and adventures with your new body." Have you met any of the others who frequent this place? Some of them, I replied, puzzling over what she had said. Several of the sprites and a satyr, a centaur, and several others. A satyr, she raised an eyebrow quizzically. Lord Pan obviously has some favor to ask. Else he would not send a satyr. Now what could be so urgent for him? Our conversation continued and eventually took a different route. By this time I was learning to live within the strange population of this very strange house and accept their very different ways. I still found it a little disturbing to be in conversation with a totally nude and extremely lovely nymph in such intimate surroundings. Add to my confusion the feeling that the frescoes were actually alive and watching us, and you have some idea of the strangeness of the place. Eventually I said I must go and get ready for dinner, and the queen agreed, smiling and saying, I shall send a guide with you to show you the quick way. She beckoned to a figure in the fresco, and with a brief flicker the lithe figure of a nymph materialized before her. The queen gave her instructions and then told me to follow the nymph to the exit, adding that George would not be able to enter her domain, as this would harm him. Within a few yards I was blinking in the sun and turned to see only a deep shadow on the wall I had apparently stepped through. Strangely, this did not alarm me, and I simply grinned and ran to find my way back into the house to find George and my aunt ready for supper. Several times after this I found myself drawn to visit the queen in her labyrinth, always when George was away to Gialadia and her people on his, now almost her, own. Each time I returned to the surface in as mysteriously short and enigmatic a route as before, once emerging in the fountain at the center of the swimming pool. 3 months after returning home, my testicles retracted into my abdomen. This caused me some discomfort for about a week, but then it passed and I soon became aware that the empty scrotum was also reforming, becoming a pair of rather prominent lips. My male equipment, too, was now shrinking rapidly and changing its orientation. It now pointed downward and slightly backward so that I needed to squat to urinate. While the core shrunk, the foreskin didn't, and gradually a crevasse was opening between my legs, reaching from the stub of my male equipment to a point just in front of my anus. All of this took several months to happen, and I did not notice it at first. To my surprise, I still got some quite powerful erections and experienced orgasms at regular intervals. I also discovered that the lips surrounding my growing vulva were slightly erectile and pleasantly sensitive to stimulus. This was especially so of the tissue inside the deepening crevasse, as it appeared to be lined by the tissues formerly covering my glands. Comparing notes with George, the first discovered that he was experiencing the same transition. However, his upper body was also becoming covered in fine golden hair, his naturally blonde head changing to the gold of the hair on his body and growing thicker down his neck and across his shoulders. His head changed as well to a more feline appearance, his ears migrating upwards and raising tufted points, while his nose and mouth became leonine. While his nipples became teats and slight breasts formed, his upper torso became muscular and very feline. By contrast, soon after my bulls retracted, my nipples began to enlarge, the areola rising and spreading into domes crowned by thick nipples, which were incredibly sensitive to touch. Within 6 months, I had noticeable breasts developing, and Aunt Selena suggested that I should start wearing a training bra. For long periods, nothing seemed to change, and then I would notice that something had happened or adjusted and moved me closer to being fully female. 6 months after leaving my school for the last time, the mirror showed a curvaceous female figure with nice breasts, good hips and buttocks toned by riding, long shapely legs, and a striking, rather than pretty, face. My hair had grown longer too and now reached below my shoulders, light brunette and silky. It hung straight and, though fine, was thick enough to form a heavy mane around my head. Only in my crutch was I still obviously not a woman, and that was changing slowly but steadily. George, by contrast, was fully female, her hairless stomach and crotch accentuating her full and generous vulva, set off by her fine golden hair on her powerfully yet beautifully muscled legs. Her feet had fully changed to clawed and padded feline form, and her hands sported shorter fingers with retractable claws. A long and tufted tail provided her with balance as she ran or leapt gracefully and beautifully, and she could no longer bear to wear any clothes. Her days were now spent among her own kind, and she returned to the house only to see me and to sleep. Georgiana was now a very happy person. George the sad and unwanted boy was gone, erased from the memories of all who had known him. Georgiana of the Feminized was a much happier person, and my friend. The house obviously reacted to my own thoughts as well, and one such response as to my interest discovered the previous Christmas in leather and corsetry. Suddenly there was a range of leather bustiers, panties, shorts, slacks, and skirts. Karen and, to my surprise, Aunt Selena encouraged me to explore this and other fetish wear that I found interesting at this time. I had lots of fun, but it was single and exploratory. Neither of them attempted to engage in anything more. As my breast developed, it firmed up, and although it was not large, it was very shapely and firm, even unsupported, standing proud with my nipples large and dark. Between my legs the crevasse deepened and the outer lips became fatter and thicker. My male equipment finally submerged itself between these and remained hidden inside the now formed internal lips, which had formerly been my foreskin. Even my piss hole had migrated to a point further back. But most wonderfully, I discovered an opening right at the end of the crevasse that deepened and widened and eventually became my vagina. About this time I discovered what an orgasm was really like and wanted more. A month after my 15th birthday, I began to menstruate. Even though I had been prepared for this, it was still a traumatic experience, especially as a former male. The new identity. My 15th birthday was, if anything, even better than my 14th. For one thing, I was now wholly female and had to accept the verdict of the women I lived with that I was already stunning and would get even more striking. It was also time that I returned to the normal world and prepared to learn how I would have to bridge the worlds the house guarded so that I could take my eventual place as the next Mistress of Change. Now my education in the arcane arts began in earnest. Each of the people of change appointed a mentor and tutor for me. My days were spent learning the magic of each and the art of blending these to my human limitations. I had triumph and frustration in equal measure as this process continued. From my labyrinthine queen, Aphrodite's, came the gift of a sort of telepathy and the training in how to use it and control it. She also gave me another gift of which I will say only that it makes for enormous pleasure in bed with a companion. From the forest peoples, the satyrs, fauns, and tree nymphs came the knowledge of the living world of plant and animal, and from the water sprites the knowledge of water, its power, and its populace. Jacqueline and the Feminized taught me to move with grace, to keep my body toned, and to relax completely. They taught me, too, how to see the future and the past and to be in the present elsewhere than where I was to see and witness what I needed to see and witness. I also learned to fade from sight and to move myself from one place to another by magic. A trick, once mastered, that would stand me in good stead in the years to come. The werfolk taught me control and the dark magic of the heart and anger. My aunt taught me to control, to discern right from wrong, and above all else, to know that what was wanted or desired was not always the same as what was right. The year passed almost without notice. It was crammed with new and sometimes fearful knowledge and experience. At the end of it, I knew what it would take to be the Mistress of Change, and I knew why this place had to be defended at all cost. I was also grateful for the knowledge that I would have the support of Shirella and her people, Georgiana and hers, and all the other centaurs and sprites, nymphs, satyrs, and fauns. A new experience. Once I had turned 16 and reached a level of knowledge and education that enabled me to pass a set of quite difficult exams, my private education drew to a close. Georgiana had long since left the house to live with her own, and, though I saw her regularly, she was going her own way guided by her people. It was time for me to return to the wider world and continue the education I would need to defend change. Aunt arranged for me to go to a really good finishing school in Europe, and I was duly enrolled as Miss Philippa de Grey with an impressive pedigree and a reasonable allowance. Here I discovered that the time spent with the nymphs, fauns, and other denizens of change had actually gifted me with some really worthwhile attributes. Apart from the fact that my legs were long and lithe, my bust firm and well-shaped, and my derriere classically firm and, with a very narrow waist, apparently beautifully proportioned, I had no inhibitions about being naked. Despite the fact that my crotch was almost hairless and my vulva slightly overgenerous. I shared a room with one other girl, a very athletic type named Patricia Coxwell, who I took a liking to as soon as we met. Fortunately, the feeling was mutual and we settled in very well together. "I'm sorry about the name," she joked. "Afraid I'm stuck with it until I can get some idiot to marry me." She laughed, introducing herself. Her joking about this hid something else, and I sensed this. Then, remembering the mind trick that the Queen of the Labyrinth had taught me, I opened my mind and saw in a flash that it was not boys she was interested in. "Marriage isn't the only option these days," I responded. "You could just change it. Or yourself if it came to it." Her desire triggered a response in me. So far, I had not engaged in any sexual act with anyone else. Now, it seemed I had both the opportunity and someone with the desire. Wondering if I was making a mistake and reasonably sure that we had some time before either of us would be looked for, I began to undress, keeping the conversation going and suggesting that I needed to change my bra and panties. "Could you undo my hooks?" I asked innocently and sensed her pent-up desire as she fumbled with the fastening. "Thank you," I grinned, adding wickedly, "I don't mind if you would like to." I turned to face her, letting the bra fall to the floor, and continued, "Why don't you take your things off too? We could explore some of my feelings as well." I smiled at her blush. "I'm new to this, but I think you can teach me if I do it wrong." "Oh, Philippa," she gasped, "you don't know how much I have wanted to do this with you." "Perhaps I do," I whispered as I helped her to unclip her bra and dropped it to join mine and her blouse on the floor. To my surprise, my slit was wet by the time I shed my panties, and our scent mingled as we entwined on my bed, our mouths locked in a deep kiss. Gently she teased my nipples, which responded by growing rigid and hard under her touch. Copying her, I teased hers and was rewarded by their responding. Her hand next found my slit and teased me open to find first the delicate and now well-lubricated tissue of the inner lips, then my clitoris sending waves of desire and pleasure through me. Even my masturbation had never produced anything like the sensations now coursing through me as she explored my sex with her expert hand. But she had even more in mind. Spreading my legs wide, she slid down until she could engage her mouth, sending her tongue deep into my now gushing vagina, then exploring the labia and teasing my clitoris. She brought me to the edge of the orgasmic plateau and held me there until I was begging for release. Then, with a deft touch, sent me over the edge in a huge wave of orgasm. Then it was my turn to do the same for her. An hour later, both glowing and sated, we showered and then dressed. It was definitely going to be an educational year. This was to be the beginning of a relationship that would flower and grow. It would stand the tests and stresses of the school and its politics, of the inevitable rivalries and jealousies, and blossom into a wonderful and fulfilling love for each other in due course. But on this first lovemaking, we could not anticipate this. Instead, we could only live for the moment and wait to see what would happen. That night, though, I cheated just a little, for I used the power of scrying to check the future and liked some of what I saw. I also made a little magic to protect this wonderful girl and increase our attraction for each other. This was a power I had learned well from my various teachers over the year at Change. I had apparently inherited my great-aunt Augusta's ability in this direction. Only one thing still worried me over all the changes that I had undergone since coming to Change. That was the knowledge that I could never have a male companion at Change. This had been spelled out to me in no uncertain terms, and I knew enough now to know that it would be dangerous for me as well as changing any partner irredeemably. All this and more would have to be addressed as and when the need arose. For now, I could enjoy Patricia and she me. The school itself provided an excellent education, and the teachers were all first class. Under their tuition, I rapidly mastered French and German and some Italian. Mathematics and history were my great passions, as was English literature. The teacher for the subject was a Shakespearean authority, and our studies of the great bard's work were enlivened by her declaiming the passionate and the fiery speeches and passages of the works with passion and feeling. Her love of Shakespeare was equaled only by the breadth and depth of her knowledge of the poetry of Herbert, Donne, Blake, Milton, Byron, Burns, and the later poets such as Hopkins and Betjeman. Our studies once again enlivened by the declamation and analysis of the allegoric references. Likewise, our history studies embraced cultural as well as political influences, and we visited Rome, Florence, Milan, Venice, Vienna, Paris, London, Barcelona, Madrid, Athens. Istanbul and Malta in our quests for the history, both living and past, and the wonderful legacies of the art of the ages around us. Through it all, the bond between Patricia and me grew stronger all the time. In London, we discovered another shared interest, one we explored more and more from there on, leather, and growing from this an interest in bondage sex. It became our little game to wear some item of leather, preferably a naughty piece, no matter where we were. The terms passed rapidly, almost too rapidly because it was soon approaching time when we would be going our separate ways. The 18 months spent at the Collegiate Girls' Finishing Academy seemed almost to have flashed past in a blaze of activity. Patricia and I faced our imminent parting glumly. Then two things happened that seemed almost miraculous. Aunt arrived at the school and turned out to know Patricia's family rather well. This resulted in an invitation to her to come to Change. The second was the discovery that we had both secured places at Oxford. Our future suddenly took on a different aspect, and we knew that we could look forward to exploring our relationship for a long time yet. For the moment, we took time out to travel home to Change and to enjoy the house, the company, and each other as often as possible. Ahead lay long years of happiness, some sadness, and many battles to preserve our beloved home and its many inhabitants. But, for the present, I could enjoy my youth and my love. Epilogue. In the summer of my youth, the future seemed so far away. Now that I am Mistress of Change, I feel the weight of the years and the knowledge that must be handed on. Now it is my turn to find a young boy in need of a home who must become the Mistress of Change in his turn. There are 3 candidates among my relations, and I am watching them carefully. The task is not an easy one, and I must choose with care. My beloved aunt now rests beneath the house where one day I must join her. Karen, Colleen, once Colin, Michelle, Charlene, once Charles, and Olga have all gone to join there, and my friends beyond the great divide between the material and the spiritual. Others drawn by the house, as it needed them, have taken their places over the years. Alexandra, Pauline, and Stephanie have come to take care of the house itself, and Ruth, Megan, and Bridget take care of the gardens helped by others. Gieladia, Shirella, Garth have joined Aunt Selena. Ninetale remains, but is even more mischievous than when I first knew him. Shirella's pups are now full-grown and lead her people. They will provide an escort for my successor when he begins his change. Now is the autumn of my life. It has been full and enjoyable, and no, I do not regret losing my manhood in the least.
Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access.